All right, let's dive in. Today, we're going to step into a possible future. We're breaking down a speculative look at the year 2025, a story that imagines a really fundamental test of the rule of law in America.
Okay, so just to be super clear right up front, what we're about to explore comes from a specific source. It's a narrative written by historian Heather Cox Richardson. She's basically sketched out a speculative version of 2025, imagining a year defined by a massive constitutional showdown.
And this whole narrative really hinges on one powerful idea. As Heather Cox Richardson puts it, the administration acted as if the laws and the Constitution that underpins them don't exist. So this wasn't about just bending the rules. In her telling, it was about acting as if the rules were just gone. All right, so how does this whole new order actually get started? Well, according to Heather Cox Richardson's account, it all begins with a few key moves right out of the gate. Heather Cox Richardson's narrative kicks off right after the 2024 election with a social media post from Elon Musk. He posts Novus Ordo Seclorum, which, is Latin for New World Order. And in her telling, this isn't just some random post. It's framed as the symbolic opening shot, a declaration of intent to fundamentally change how government works. So Musk's role here gets very real, very fast. He's put in charge of this powerful new department nicknamed DOGE. Its mission? To slash $2 trillion from the federal budget by getting rid of entire programs and tons of jobs. It's presented as this huge effort to just reshape the government from the inside out.
And Richardson describes a pretty tangible result here. While DOGE apparently didn't hit those massive spending cut targets, it did manage to cut nearly 10% of the federal workforce. She makes a point to connect this directly to the stated goals of Project 2025, drawing a straight line between the plan and the action.
Okay, so we've seen the what. Now the story pivots to the why. We're going to explore the ideology that, according to Heather Cox Richardson, was used to justify bypassing the law itself.
The source traces this whole philosophy back to a German political theorist named Carl Schmitt. Now, he's a pretty controversial figure, known for his association with the Nazi Party, and his theories are all about radically reshaping the very idea of executive power.
So what is this exception theory all about? Well, basically, it argues that a leader's real power comes from their ability to declare an emergency. That declaration creates an exception, which lets them suspend normal laws and act totally outside the Constitution. In this view, it's the leader's will, not the law, that becomes the ultimate authority.
And Heather Cox Richardson points out how this theory was actually being said out loud, highlighting this quote attributed to J.D. Vance. It really just boils all those complex ideas down to their absolute core. There's no law, there's just power. A pretty stark way of putting it.
So how did all this theory play out in the real world? Well, the source lists several key examples, declaring 9 separate emergencies to get around Congress, launching a tariff war, which is a power that's explicitly reserved for Congress, and using a process called budget reconciliation to push through legislation. And when Congress tried to investigate, the administration reportedly just refused to comply.
But these actions, at least in Heather Cox Richardson's telling, did not go unanswered. Her narrative shows how both the public and the legal system started to push back, and hard.
And according to this narrative, the pushback started almost immediately. By February, Democratic attorneys general were already in court filing preemptive lawsuits. Then in March, a major flashpoint. The administration allegedly defies a federal judge's order. And by April, that resistance is spilling out into the streets with these big nationwide rallies. The public protests weren't random either. They're described as this strategic, escalating series of events. It started with targeted actions like Tesla takedowns, then it grew into these broader hands-off rallies to protect civil rights, and finally, it all culminated in No King's Day, a direct challenge to what protesters saw as an unconstitutional grab for power.
So all of this building resistance, it leads to what Heather Cox Richardson presents as the big turning point in the year's story, the moment where the tide really starts to turn.
And the scale of this opposition, wow, it's really captured in this one massive number. On October 18th, for that No King's Day protest, Heather Cox Richardson reports that over 7 million people demonstrated across the country. That's a huge nationwide display of public feeling.
And that public anger? Well, the narrative says it translated directly into votes, big time. The November off-year elections are described as this wave of Democratic victories, winning governorships in Virginia and New Jersey, nabbing mayorships in cities like New York and Miami, and flipping more than 20% of the Republican-held seats that were up for grabs.
And this next moment is framed as a really huge deal, because this is where the opposition becomes bipartisan. The administration's refusal to release the Epstein files creates this major standoff with Congress. So a bipartisan group of representatives forces a vote, and they pass a Transparency Act with an overwhelming majority, a really clear break between some congressional Republicans and the White House.
All this momentum culminates in this rapid-fire 1-2-3 punch of legal defeats for the administration right at the end of the year. Congress passes a law, the administration misses the deadline, a federal judge steps in, and even the Supreme Court weighs in against them. It's portrayed as the legal system just decisively reasserting its authority.
So, when you put it all together, what's the big takeaway from this 2025 Chronicle? Richardson concludes her story by focusing on the nation's response and this idea of reclaiming the rule of law.
And to really drive this point home about the loss of momentum, Heather Cox Richardson highlights a quote from the right-wing thinker Curtis Yarvin. The way she presents it, even some supporters could see the writing on the wall. The assessment was stark. The movement was failing, not because of the opposition, but because, in his words, it deserves to fail.
So in the end, the central conclusion from Heather Cox Richardson is that the very attempt to operate outside the law actually had the opposite effect. It roused a massive popular movement of everyday Americans to stand up and actively defend the principles of their own democracy. And so the narrative leaves us with this final, really powerful question. It connects the events of this speculative 2025 to the nation's upcoming 250th anniversary, and it asks us all to think about not just what the rule of law is, but how it is actively defended. And that's our look into Heather Cox Richardson's Chronicle of 2025. Thanks for joining us.